Hey, what is up guys? Kalem or KalemsFishtanks, and in today's video, I'm going to be giving you guys 5 tips I wish I had before starting in planted tanks. I've been keeping planted tanks for about 7 or 8 years now. I don't know exactly, but these are basically a couple tips I wish I knew before I had got started that would have really helped me out along my journey. So let's get started. So my first tip is to set your goals, budget, and expectation before you start buying equipment. The first thing I would do is decide whether or not I'm going to be using CO2 or not on my tanks. CO2 is a game changer, but it's pretty expensive and it is a little bit scary for new aquarists, so most aquarists opt not to use CO2 for their first planted tank. So what I would then do is go look for inspiration. I'd go somewhere like Instagram on #PlantedTank, for example, and I'd look through a bunch of the recent photos, figure out whether or not they're using CO2, what kind of lights they're using, what plants they're able to grow, what soil they're using, and take note of all this stuff and kind of mix a bunch of these together to find what you want. The biggest limitation for a bunch of new people is that they don't have CO2, so you have to be careful to look for CO2 diffusers or CO2 drop checkers, which would indicate someone's using CO2, which means you wouldn't necessarily be able to mimic the scape as easily. CO2 is a huge game changer and makes plants a lot easier, but like I mentioned, a lot of beginner aquarists choose not to opt for CO2, which I totally understand. So this next tip is kind of a skill you'll have to learn with planted tanks that a lot of people have problems with, and that is patience. Especially if you're doing a low-tech tank, things are going to happen slowly, and sometimes there's nothing you can really do to speed them up, and you'll just have to be patient. A lot of people make the mistake of over-pumping their tanks with fertilizers because they think that'll make things grow faster. Especially in low-tech tanks, this can cause a lot of problems, so I wouldn't really recommend doing that. You're just going to have to be patient and wait for things to happen naturally. The other way patience has a big part in this hobby is when it comes to problem solving. When you get problems in your planted tank, there's going to be a lot of information on what it could be. I always recommend changing one thing at a time and then waiting 2 weeks to see what happens. And if it does make things significantly worse, if you change that, then maybe after only 1 week, make other changes. But don't change too many things at once, because then you'll never figure out what the problem is. And maybe if you changed that one thing, you would have fixed that. But then since you did the other thing, the problem got worse, that kind of thing. So always change one thing at once. This is kind of hard to explain. And then wait 2 weeks. Hopefully you guys got my point there. Kind of tripping over my words a little bit, but basically focus on one thing at a time, whether that's your lights, your fertilizers, your filter, that kind of thing. Don't change everything at once. Take things one step at a time and give your tank time to adjust to see if the change actually has any effect before you start changing other things. I think I explained that a little bit clearer. So my third tip is to learn about the dark start or the dry start method. These are both great options that really help in the beginning stages of a planted tank. If you've kept a planted tank before, you'll know that the first couple months are usually a nightmare. You'll run into lots of brown algae and different algae while the tank is cycling and getting set up, and these are really annoying to deal with. They can kill a bunch of plants and they're really just no fun. What the dark start and dry start method do is they basically cycle your tank before you add water, for example with the dry start, or you add plants, for example with the dark start. These both give you a head start and get your tank cycled before you can start running into algae, which really gives you a big advantage when setting up a new tank. I'm not going to talk too much about these, but there's lots of great videos on YouTube where you can learn more about them. Some of you may have noticed a trash bag in my last couple videos behind me, and I'm basically dark starting this tank because I'm planning to have a bunch of rarer plants in here, and I really don't want the tank to be cycling while they're in here because it could end up killing them. So I'm doing the dark start method to give this tank a head start before I do add plants. Now tip number 4, this is a bit of a more difficult one, but there is so many different plants in our hobby, so I recommend really doing your research before you go out and start buying plants. A great resource for this is Tropica's website. There's lots of other plant companies that have really good information on their plants, but Tropica is one I've used when I was getting started. Basically they have their whole line of plants there, all the care requirements, which ones are easy, difficulty, medium, or hard. If it's your first tank, I'd stick to mainly plants that fit under the easy difficulty category, and with this you'll learn to identify different plants if your store doesn't have them labeled, and yeah, it basically gives you an idea on what you're getting into and avoids you wasting money on plants that are just going to die. One other thing that's really helpful, a little bonus tip, is if your plants are dying and they're not cryptocorns, I'd remove them. I'd take them out of the tank, because if you have dying plants, it's just going to lead to more algae and more headaches down the road. You can also use the Tropical website to get inspiration as well. They have different layouts where they've used their plants. They have all the plant maps of all the different plants they've used, and they let you know which ones are medium, easy or difficult layouts, so it's great for finding information and getting ideas on what kind of plants you could use in an easy beginner layout. And my fifth and final tip is to stock your tank lightly. A lot of people think since they have a planted tank and they have some plants in there, it'll magically take care of all the nitrates and they can add a ton more fish. What happens is if there is too much nitrates, you're going to get a lot of algae, and this can be bad for your plants. Your plants can then start dying, more nitrate and ammonia, and then you can end up killing your fish. What I always recommend doing is stocking your planted tanks lightly. It'll make it way easier if you have a lot less fish to keep your tank algae free and looking healthy. For example, on my 24-gallon Dutch, I think I have about 10 ember tetras, and then 2 autosynclists, and then a couple cherry shrimp as well. But that tank's super lightly stocked, but I never run into any algae problems with it. Most of my planted tanks are on a similar stocking level, probably a bit more than that one. That's kind of an extreme, but I would keep your tanks lightly stocked, especially don't overstock them just because they're planted. Chances are, if you do overstock, your plants won't be able to keep up with all the nitrates you're producing, and you'll have to get algae to take care of the rest of them, which could lead to more problems. But anyways guys, that about wraps it up. I hope these tips helped you, and if you did find this video helpful, leave a like or let me know down below in the comments if you'd like a part 2. I have a bunch more ideas for other helpful tips I could give for beginners. But anyways guys, this was KalemsFishtanks. Thank you guys so much for watching. Peace.